The night of September 17th, 1944, south of Eindhoven, in the Netherlands. Rain dripped from the low clouds onto the open doors of a C-47 transport aircraft as it shuddered in turbulence. Inside, the men of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, sat in silence faces, streaked with camouflage paint, fingers checking and rechecking the metal latches of their equipment bundles. Each man carried nearly 100 pounds of gear, but this night there was something new. 2 full bandoliers of rifle ammunition instead of 1. 16 clips for the M1 Garand 128 rounds of 30-06 caliber. Some stuffed extra loose rounds into pockets, web belts, even helmets. A few joked grimly that they were carrying more weight in bullets than in food. When the red light flicked on, Sergeant Bill Evans muttered under his breath, "Guess the brass don't plan on seeing us for a couple of days." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're in Flordies, tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was right. Within 48 hours, half the battalion would be fighting cut off near Sun, without radio contact, resupply, or armour support. They would hold positions longer than any airborne force had ever been ordered to stand alone. And the doctrine that sent them there, the doctrine of light, fast, expendable shock troops, would shatter in those Dutch fields. This is the story of why American paratroopers began carrying double ammunition loads and how a single operational failure forced a fundamental change in how airborne soldiers understood survival. In the early years of the war, airborne units were designed for brief, violent operations. Seize an airfield, destroy a bridge, then withdraw or link up with advancing ground forces. Their supply doctrine reflected that. Every man carried 1 day's rations, a single canteen, and ammunition for 1 or 2 firefights. Resupply would come by airdrop or by relief columns moving up from the beaches. But those assumptions were written in 1942 before Sicily, before Salerno, before the bitter lesson of Normandy. When the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into Normandy in June 1944, they learned that temporary isolation could last not hours, but days. Fog, anti-aircraft fire, and scattered drops left entire battalions surrounded. Radio contact failed. Glider resupply was impossible under German fire. By dawn on D-Day, many paratroopers had fired through nearly all their ammunition. Captain Frank Lillyman, commanding the 502nd's Pathfinder detachment, recorded afterward, "We took Carentan with what was left in our rifles. Some men had 1 clip between them. We stripped the dead for ammo." Those reports reached the airborne logistics planners in England. Their analysis concluded that, for each rifleman, expected expenditure in the first 24 hours was roughly 240 rounds, almost twice what the manuals had projected. Yet, in practice, paratroopers still carried less than half that. For Operation Market Garden 3 months later, commanders tried to correct that failure quietly and without admitting doctrine had been wrong. General Maxwell Taylor approved an increase in individual ammunition loads, but the decision filtered down in unofficial ways. Officers encouraged men to take what you can carry. Some units issued spare bandoliers scrounged from supply dumps. The quartermasters called it an experimental issue. The men called it common sense. Still, no one quite believed they would need it. The airborne divisions had been promised rapid link-up with British armour within 48 hours. Montgomery's plan envisioned paratroopers holding bridges only briefly, opening the road for XXX Corps. In theory, the need for sustained defence didn't exist. The war was supposed to be mobile, mechanised, decisive. But paratroopers, veterans of Normandy, had stopped trusting theory. Private Ed Shames of Easy Company remembered hearing one of his men say on the airfield, "Double ammo or double graves, take your pick." By dawn on September 18th, reality justified the extra weight. The 506th was dug in along the Eindhoven road, holding open the corridor for the British tanks that never came. German resistance, thought to be scattered remnants, was instead organised counterattack. Elements of the 107th Panzer Brigade struck from the north, their Panthers firing high-explosive shells into the ditches where the Americans crouched. The paratroopers fought them off with rifles, bazookas and mortars until darkness. No resupply arrived. C-47 seconds carrying ammunition drops were diverted by weather. British columns were halted by blown bridges near Sonne. The paratroopers rationed their fire. Men who had carried 200 rounds now had fewer than 50 by morning. Sergeant Evans wrote in his pocket diary, "Every clip I kept means one more hour we hold. I used to think carrying extra ammo was just weight. Now it's time." To understand why the double-load decision mattered, one has to look at how fragile airborne logistics were in 1944. An infantry division advancing along roads consumed roughly 600 tons of supplies per day. A parachute division in isolation had access to none of that. Everything, food, ammunition, medical supplies, had to fit into individual packs or be dropped by air. But airdrops required control of the skies, clear weather, and precise coordinates, all things seldom present in the first days of an operation. After Normandy, the Airborne Board's post-operation report concluded, "Resupply of small, scattered units proved impractical. Units must be prepared to subsist for 48 hours unaided." That recommendation quietly became doctrine. The term, self-sufficiency window, appeared in planning papers, 48 hours of food, water, and ammunition per man. But in practice, self-sufficient meant carry it on your back. The official equipment list for a paratrooper already weighed over 100 pounds. Parachute, reserve chute, M1 rifle, entrenching tool, grenades, canteen, rations, and often radio batteries or demolition gear. Adding a second bandolier pushed many men to their physical limit. Jumps from low altitude worsened the risk of leg and back injuries. Yet when given the choice, most chose the extra ammunition. They did so not out of bravado, but because they understood the mathematics of survival. A Garand fired 8 rounds in 4 seconds. A man in a firefight could empty both bandoliers in under 10 minutes. With double load, he had perhaps 20 minutes of sustained combat, barely enough, but infinitely better than running dry. The shift was psychological as much as logistical. Airborne troops began to think of themselves not as raiders waiting for relief, but as self-contained garrisons expected to endure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the small Dutch village of Nuenen, that endurance was tested to the breaking point. On September 20th, paratroopers of the 506th, supported by a handful of British tanks, entered the village to clear it of German forces. They advanced street by street under sniper and mortar fire. Within hours, they were counterattacked by elements of the 107th Panzer Brigade again, this time with Stug assault guns. Communications broke down. British armour withdrew. The paratroopers were left isolated. Lieutenant Edward Tipper later recalled, "We fought for the same buildings 3 times. Every round we fired, we could feel the pile getting smaller. The sound of empties hitting the cobblestones stayed with me more than the gunfire." By nightfall, the Americans pulled back toward Eindhoven, low on ammunition but still organised. They had held the town for nearly 2 days, exactly 48 hours, long enough for reinforcements to re-establish the line. Of the 260 men who entered Nuenen, 67 were casualties. None were taken prisoner. The lesson was brutal but unmistakable. Market Garden failed, but the paratroopers' prolonged resistance proved the necessity of heavier initial loads. After the operation, the Airborne Board standardized double ammunition issue for all parachute infantry. Each rifleman would jump with 16 clips minimum. Each machine gun team would carry 3 times the normal belt load. It was no longer assumed that they would be rescued. This quiet doctrinal change rippled through every airborne operation that followed, from the crossing of the Rhine in 1945 to the airborne assaults in Korea years later. 48 hours solo became the unspoken standard. The time a paratrooper could expect to fight, bleed, and survive with only what he carried. But to the men who lived through those days, the numbers meant little. Sergeant Evans, wounded near Eindhoven, was found unconscious beside an empty rifle and a single remaining clip. When medics revived him, he muttered, "Guess I packed just enough." His words would later appear, anonymously, in the 101st Division's after-action report as a simple field note. Recommendation: increase individual ammunition loads, men will use it. It was the most understated doctrinal revolution of the war. By the winter of 1944, the doctrine of 48 hours solo had hardened from quiet improvisation into necessity. Every paratrooper in Europe understood what it meant. You carried everything that would keep you alive, because no one could guarantee anything beyond the jump. The transformation was most visible not in speeches or manuals, but in weight. Before Normandy, an airborne infantryman jumped with roughly 90 pounds of equipment. By the time the 101st Airborne prepared for the Bastogne defence in December 1944, that figure had grown to 125. The new standard load included 16 to 20 rifle clips, 2 fragmentation grenades, 2 incendiaries, a combat knife, rations for 2 days, and a reserve of medical supplies, a tourniquet, sulfur powder, and at least 1 morphine syringe. The result was paradoxical. Soldiers designed to be the lightest, most mobile of the army were now the heaviest. Yet the men accepted it because they had learned that mobility meant little without ammunition. In early December, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been refitting near Mourmelon, France. The division was enjoying what the men called the first real winter since home: clean barracks, hot meals, mail delivery. Few believed they would be deployed again before spring. Then Ardennes broke. German armoured columns smashed through the thin American lines on December 16th. The next day, trucks began arriving at Mourmelon. Within hours, the 101st was ordered north to reinforce the town of Bastogne. Most of the division's heavy gear vehicles, extra clothing, even tents, was left behind. The men climbed aboard open trucks in snow and darkness, carrying only what they could wear and what ammunition they could strap to their bodies. Lieutenant Lynn, Buck Compton of Easy Company, recalled, "I had 2 bandoliers across my chest, another around my waist. You couldn't sit down without hearing cartridges clink." The officers didn't have to tell us why. Everyone remembered Holland. When the convoy reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th, they unloaded directly into the snow and began digging. Within 2 days, the town was surrounded, supply routes were cut, and the paratroopers' new doctrine was tested as never before. For nearly a week, Bastogne existed as a frozen island behind enemy lines. No supply convoys, no artillery shells beyond what had been brought in trucks. The airborne division's artillerymen carefully rationed their fire, calculating that each gun could fire no more than 10 shells per day without exhausting stocks. Ammunition for small arms was guarded like gold. Major Dick Winters wrote later, "We treated bullets like food. Everyone had to count." The double load carried from Mourmelon allowed the 506th and 327th Glider Infantry to maintain constant defensive fire even when resupply aircraft were grounded by snow. Men who had cursed the extra weight during the truck ride now credited it with survival. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th described an engagement near Foy. "The Germans attacked in waves. We fired until the barrels steamed. When we checked our bandoliers after the fight, most were empty, but none of us had run out completely. That was the difference. Meant the line didn't break." The division's after-action report for Bastogne, filed in February 1945, confirmed it. Units were able to sustain heavy defensive fire for 5 days without resupply, owing to the increased initial ammunition load carried by individual troops. What had begun as a field improvisation in Holland had become validated, a doctrine through blood and necessity. The Army Quartermaster Corps, reviewing Bastone's outcome months later, noted another implication. Increased ammunition carriage by airborne forces offsets logistical delay but imposes physical burden requiring special conditioning. That bureaucratic phrase disguised a brutal truth. The men's endurance was not infinite. Paratroopers at Bastogne marched, dug, and fought in temperatures below freezing, often on half rations. The extra 30 or 40 pounds of ammunition pressed against their chests, cut into shoulders and bruised ribs. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy fire. But the trade-off was understood and accepted. The airborne creed had evolved. Where early training films in 1942 spoke of speed, surprise, and dash, by 1945, the field manuals emphasized tenacity, self-reliance, and fire discipline. The shift from romantic to practical mirrored the shift from optimism to endurance that characterized the late war. The 48-hour doctrine had logistical consequences beyond the individual soldier. Each paratroop regiment now required additional tonnage of ammunition during staging. Before a major jump, the ammunition depots at Greenham Common or Chalgrove would prepare not only the standard crates for resupply, but double issues for pre-jump packing. Operations planners calculated that one airborne division consumed nearly 200 tons of ammunition in the first 2 days of combat, nearly equivalent to a conventional infantry division, despite being only 2/3 its size. The C-47 transport aircraft could not bear unlimited weight, so quartermasters developed a careful balancing system. Lighter food crates in exchange for heavier ammunition bundles, fewer medical supplies to make room for mortar shells. Everything became a mathematical compromise between survival and mobility. The men knew it too. The phrase, "take what kills first," circulated quietly through airborne camps. Food could wait, bullets could not. After Bastogne, paratroopers carried the doctrine forward into the next and final airborne assault of the European War, Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing of March 1945. This time, the airborne planners fully embraced the new reality. Each paratrooper was ordered to carry 240 rounds of rifle ammunition, 4 grenades, and 48 hours of rations. The official operations order specified, units must be prepared to maintain isolated positions without ground resupply for 2 days. Varsity proved the first operation where planning matched experience. Allied air superiority ensured resupply drops within 24 hours, but even with that success, many units fought isolated for longer. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, dropped near Wesel, reported heavy engagements without support for nearly 36 hours. Its casualties were severe but sustainable. None of the companies reported total ammunition depletion. Major General Matthew Ridgway, who had commanded the 82nd Airborne since Sicily, later wrote in his memoir Soldier, "The lesson of Bastogne and Holland was that paratroopers must not depend upon others for their survival. Ammunition is life, everything else is luxury." Beyond tactics, the double-load doctrine changed the psychology of airborne soldiers. Before 1944, many viewed the paratrooper as a symbol of daring and transience, a man who struck and vanished. By the war's end, he had become the archetype of endurance. The longer he held alone, the greater his honor. Interviews with veterans years later reveal this shift. Corporal Joe Behrler, who fought with the 506th and later escaped a German prison camp, described the mentality simply, "You didn't think about relief, you thought about making the ammo last. That was the measure of whether you'd done your job." That stoicism seeped into the division's culture. The 101st's insignia, the Screaming Eagle, came to represent not only aggression but persistence. Their unofficial motto after Bastogne, "We're surrounded," that simplifies things, encapsulated the same paradox that had once terrified airborne planners. Isolation could be strength if prepared for. Historically, the shift also illustrated a broader pattern of adaptation in the Allied war machine. Early in the war, American doctrine tended toward idealized precision. Each operation meticulously planned, each man allotted exact quantities of supply. Experience in North Africa and Italy exposed the fragility of those assumptions. By 1944, the army had become more empirical learning, not from theory but from accumulated failure. The airborne forces, operating on the war's margins, embodied that process most vividly. Their experience with ammunition mirrored the wider logistical evolution of the US military. At the start of the war, the standard combat load for an infantryman was 100 rounds. By 1945, it had doubled, and the supply chain expanded accordingly. Production of 30-06 ammunition peaked at nearly 4 billion rounds in 1944 alone, more than in the previous 2 years combined. The logistical abundance of the American war effort allowed tactical experimentation. The bravery of isolated units justified it. Thus, the double ammo load was both symptom and cause. It reflected an industrial capacity to supply more and a human determination to survive longer. There was, however, a silent cost. Combat medics noticed that men carrying extra ammunition suffered higher rates of spinal and joint injuries. Jumps from aircraft at low altitude increased the impact, and the additional weight often caused fractures or internal bruising upon landing. The official medical review after Market Garden estimated that up to 15% of jump injuries were aggravated by overweight loads, but there was no way back. The moral calculus of the airborne soldier had shifted irreversibly. Weight was no longer the enemy, dependence was. Captain Richard Kiley of the 505th summed it up in a post-war interview. You could always rest later. You couldn't reload if you were dead. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the surviving paratroopers returned to camps across France and England. Many had been fighting almost continuously since D-Day. Their uniforms were patched, their boots worn to thin leather, but their equipment lists were thicker than ever. At the final inspection before embarkation home, quartermasters recorded that the average paratrooper's kit weighed 132 pounds. Fully 1/3 of that was ammunition. It was not romantic. It was not glamorous. It was survival made visible. In the decades after the war, as new airborne units formed during the Cold War, the 48-hour endurance doctrine persisted. The 187th Regimental Combat Team in Korea, the 173rd in Vietnam, all trained under variations of the same rule. Fight isolated for 2 days without guarantee of support. Even modern airborne manuals trace that lineage directly to the lessons of Holland and Bastogne. The phrase self-sufficiency for 48 hours appears verbatim in Field Manual 3-21.22. The rifles and radios have changed. The principle has not. Because that principle was written not by theorists, but by men lying in snow with empty clips, counting the seconds until dawn. One can trace the evolution almost like a chain of memory, from the fog over Normandy to the frozen woods of Bastogne, from Market Garden's scattered drops to the calm riverbanks of the Rhine. Each battle taught the same lesson more clearly. A paratrooper's greatest weapon was not his parachute, nor his rifle, but his endurance, the quiet arithmetic of bullets counted and spent. In the memoirs of Major John Stopka, who commanded the 506th 3rd Battalion and was killed near Bastogne, there is an entry dated December 23, 1944. It reads, "We have enough ammunition for another day, maybe 2. That will be enough. A man can only die once. What matters is that when they come, we can still fire." 2 days later, he was killed in action. His men held the line. Looking back, the irony of the double load is almost poetic. What began as a logistical adjustment became a philosophy of war. It inverted the airborne myth. The paratrooper, originally conceived as the lightest of soldiers, became the heaviest burdened not just by steel and powder, but by the expectation to hold without hope. And yet, within that burden lay freedom. By carrying twice the weight, they freed themselves from dependence, from the fragile promise of relief. They became their own supply line, their own fortress. Perhaps that is why, in the post-war years, when veterans gathered, they rarely spoke about parachutes or gliders. They spoke about ammunition. Private Burgett once held up an old bandolier at a reunion and said simply, "This kept me alive. Not luck, not faith, not generals. This." In that moment, the technical and the human converged. The measure of a doctrine reduced to 8 brass cartridges and a strip of canvas. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army had written thousands of pages, analyzing airborne operations, its successes, failures, and innovations. But in the quiet handwriting of field reports, a single line captures what all those documents tried to say. It comes from the 101st Division's final European report, dated June 1945. Airborne operations have demonstrated that the capacity of the individual soldier to endure and fight independently determines the ultimate duration of the mission. Increased individual ammunition load has proven decisive. It reads like a sentence written by history itself, stripped of rhetoric. For the paratroopers who carried those double loads, it was not theory but lived truth. They had measured 48 hours, not in time but in bullets, and survived long enough to change the way the world understood what endurance meant. The snow had melted by March of 1945. Across Europe, the ground thawed to reveal the aftermath of 6 years of war shell craters filling with water, wrecked half-tracks rusting beside roads, helmets half buried in the mud. For the airborne divisions, the thaw brought a strange quiet. There were no more desperate encirclements, no more bridges to seize in the dark. The Great War was ending. But for the men who had lived by the 48-hour rule, the silence felt unnatural. They had trained their bodies and minds to exist in crisis, to count bullets, watch horizons, and measure time not by days or hours, but by how many clips remained. Peace, for them, was an unfamiliar country. When the 101st Airborne was ordered to the Bavarian Alps in April 1945, it was no longer the same division that had jumped over Normandy 10 months before. Its veterans carried the weight of experience heavier than any rucksack. They moved with a practiced economy, their routines honed by months of fighting without resupply. Even when trucks followed the columns, even when depots stood open, the men still hoarded ammunition and food as if the next siege waited around the corner. Captain Carwood Lipton wrote in his journal, "We all carry more than we need now. Habit, I suppose. The body learns what the mind cannot forget. That habit outlived the war. When the 506th reached Berchtesgaden in May, they entered Hitler's mountain retreat, empty rooms overlooking a valley still scarred by bombing. There were cellars full of wine and pantries of untouched food. The paratroopers, who had survived on cold rations through Bastogne's siege, looked at the abundance with disbelief. Some laughed, others turned away. Sergeant Joe Toye reportedly muttered, "All this, and we were counting crackers." It was not bitterness but recognition. The war had been fought between the empty and the full. The double-load doctrine, by the war's end, was more than logistics, it was identity. The paratrooper saw himself as self-contained, unbreakable, designed to operate alone. That mentality became the template for a new kind of soldier in the modern age. In 1946, when the US Army restructured its forces, the airborne divisions were reduced but not dissolved. A committee under General Ridgway insisted that the airborne concept remains essential to rapid, independent warfare. At its core lay the lesson of self-sufficiency, what the reports called the 48-hour endurance window. In training camps across the United States, Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, and later Camp Breckinridge, young paratroopers learned to live off their packs for 2 days. Instructors repeated stories from Holland and Bastogne as moral catechisms. You will have what you carry, nothing more. By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, those lessons had become doctrine again, though now applied to a different terrain. The 187th Regimental Combat Team executed airborne assaults deep behind enemy lines, often isolated for 48 to 72 hours before relief arrived. The supply officers noted that veterans of Europe adapted best they rationed instinctively, fired sparingly, and trusted the arithmetic of endurance. Decades later, historians studying airborne operations would calculate the statistical impact of the doctrine: increased survival rates in isolated units, more consistent defensive performance under siege conditions, fewer ammunition shortages during the first phase of operations. But statistics cannot capture what it felt like for the men themselves. In post-war interviews, veterans often spoke less of fear or victory than of weight. Weight became memory, the pull of bandoliers across shoulders, the sound of cartridges clinking as they ran, the ache in legs that never quite healed. Private First Class Jack Agnew of the 506th recalled, "You never forgot the feel of it. Even years later, when you carried groceries or a toolbox, something in your back remembered." The physical burden became symbolic. In memorial speeches and regimental reunions, officers described their men not as elite, but as burden bearers. They carried more because they had to. They survived because they refused to expect rescue. The change seeped quietly into military culture. Before 1944, the Army's ethos had been one of mobility fast advances, mechanized warfare, and logistics as a flowing river. After the airborne campaigns, a parallel ethos emerged: the culture of the encircled. This culture valued patience, improvisation, and self-discipline above speed. It found expression not only in airborne units, but in Ranger and Special Forces formations that appeared after the war. The idea that a small, isolated team could hold or act independently for 48 hours without support became the foundation for unconventional warfare. In many ways, the modern concept of the special operations soldier descends from those Dutch fields where paratroopers carried double loads and waited in vain for relief. When the Army established the Special Forces in 1952, their training manuals borrowed phrases directly from wartime airborne reports. The individual must possess the endurance and resourcefulness to operate unsupported for a minimum of 48 hours. It was a legacy, written not in theory but in exhaustion. But while doctrine celebrated endurance, the cost often remained invisible. In the late 1942s, Army medical boards began examining the long-term injuries sustained by airborne veterans. The reports were stark: spinal compression fractures, chronic knee damage, nerve injuries, all aggravated by the extreme weights carried during operations. Many men were discharged before they reached 30. Some spent the rest of their lives with braces or canes. The Army's own medical survey in 1948 concluded, "The cumulative physical stress of carrying combat loads exceeding 120 pounds for extended periods results in permanent musculoskeletal impairment in a significant percentage of airborne veterans." Yet, even as those findings circulated, the culture of stoicism made complaint impossible. Among paratroopers, pain was a private matter. Acknowledgement felt like betrayal. Corporal Francis Melle wrote to his wife in 1946, "They say the war's over, but it's still in my knees. Every step reminds me what we carried." For many, the 48-hour rule never truly ended, it lived on in the body. By the 1962nd, historians began to re-evaluate the airborne role in the Second World War. Critics argued that large-scale parachute operations were too risky, that the scattered drops and high casualties outweighed their strategic value. Supporters countered that airborne troops achieved disproportionate psychological impact and tactical disruption. Both were right. Yet, what endured beyond tactical debates was the philosophical residue, the idea that an isolated human being could, through preparation and will, sustain himself beyond the limits of expected support. In that sense, the airborne doctrine outgrew its military context. It became metaphor. Writers and filmmakers later seized upon it as emblem of resilience. The image of a lone paratrooper holding his post for 2 days, cut off from command, symbolized the broader human confrontation with uncertainty. When Cornelius Ryan published A Bridge Too Far in 1974, he wrote that every paratrooper carried his world on his back. It was not only literal truth, but moral summation. During Vietnam, when helicopter-borne troops replaced parachutes, the 48-hour endurance principle reappeared under new terminology: self-sustainment window. Air cavalry and long-range reconnaissance patrols were instructed to operate autonomously for 48 to 72 hours. They carried extra ammunition, rations, and medical gear, just as their predecessors had in Europe. Officers who traced their lineage to the airborne divisions spoke openly of that inheritance. Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, a veteran of the 11th Airborne, told his men in 1965, "You are paratroopers without parachutes. Everything you need, you bring. Everything you carry, you defend." Even modern U.S. Army Ranger and Special Forces selection courses preserve vestiges of this ethos. Candidates are evaluated on how they perform after 2 days without resupply, 48 hours of isolation, exhaustion, and minimal support. The number is not arbitrary. It is the direct descendant of the airborne lesson. Time transformed those practical adaptations into myth. At reunions in the 1980 and 1990, surviving veterans of the 82nd and 101st told stories that blurred the line between fact and folklore. They spoke of men firing until barrels glowed, of counting bullets under flares, of hearing the last clip snap home like a heartbeat. Historians, checking the records, found much of it true. One report from the 502nd Parachute Infantry's defence of Bizery during Bastogne documented that several squads indeed reached their final clips before relief arrived. The difference between holding and collapse, the report noted, was the foresight to carry beyond standard load. Thus, myth and documentation converged. The legend of the double load matched the archive. For younger generations of soldiers, the story became parable. The 48-hour ordeal stood as proof that human endurance could outlast logistical failure. Yet there was always another side, one hidden beneath the official triumphs. After the war, the Army's Operational Research Section compiled data on ammunition expenditure versus casualties in airborne operations. Their findings revealed a grim correlation. Units that fired less often, either through rationing or shortage, suffered higher fatality rates in prolonged isolation. In other words, the doctrine saved divisions but cost individuals. The men who carried extra ammunition fought longer, but those who carried less often died before resupply arrived. No report could quantify the moral weight of that knowledge. In later years, when veterans met, they sometimes joked that the lightest pack belonged to the dead. It was gallows humour, but behind it lay memory of comrades who had chosen to move faster, to carry less, and never returned. Modern analysts often study the airborne campaigns for their tactical innovation, but the deeper lesson is human: adaptability through humility. The paratroopers' willingness to discard pre-war assumptions to change what they carried, how they fought, how they survived, was an act of collective learning under fire. Few armies in history have rewritten their doctrine so quickly or so quietly. The airborne divisions did not wait for orders. They adapted because experience demanded it. That pragmatic courage, more than any single battle, defined them. It is no accident that after the war, when veterans wrote memoirs, the most common words were not victory or glory, but hold, wait, carry, and endure. When the 101st Airborne returned home in late 1945, many men kept a single bandolier or clip as souvenir. Some mounted it on walls, others stored it in drawers. In museums today, those artifacts appear small canvas faded, brass dulled by time. But each represents the invisible arithmetic of survival. At the National Infantry Museum in Georgia, one exhibit displays a paratrooper's full kit from Operation Market Garden, 128 rounds of ammunition, weighed precisely. The placard beneath it reads, 48 hours of fire. Visitors seldom linger long, yet those who do often notice the simplicity, the absence of ornament. The story requires no embellishment, because the truth of endurance is always quiet. Outside the military sphere, the doctrine's legacy lived on in ways its creators never imagined. Psychologists studying resilience in the 1970 seconds cited the airborne model as an example of stress adaptation. Individuals trained to accept isolation and limited resources while maintaining operational focus. The phrase 48-hour mindset entered some leadership courses, denoting the ability to function autonomously during uncertainty. Corporate handbooks and survival guides later borrowed the metaphor stripped of its martial context to describe emotional or logistical self-reliance. In that sense, the paratroopers' endurance transcended its origin. What had once been born of necessity became universal shorthand for perseverance. Yet, for the men themselves, remembrance was more complicated. Some could not let go of those 48 hours, replaying them in dreams for decades. The sound of rifles, the whistle of mortars, the endless counting of rounds, the double load that saved their lives also anchored them to the past. In one letter preserved in the U.S. Army Heritage Archives, written in 1953 by former Staff Sergeant Bill Evans, the same man whose diary opened this story, he confessed, "I used to think about how many clips I had left. Now I think about how many years I've got left, and it feels the same. You're always counting, always waiting for resupply that doesn't come." He died in 1971, his service medals still wrapped in the cloth of his old bandolier. When historians today study the Second World War, they often look for decisive moments, battles, treaties, inventions. But the true revolutions often occur in silence, in the weight a soldier decides to carry. The decision of thousands of paratroopers to strap on one more bandolier changed nothing on a map and everything in military thought. It marked the moment when technology bowed to human endurance, when survival depended not on machinery or logistics, but on the will to prepare for isolation. From that decision flowed a lineage of doctrine, ethos, and identity that shaped the next 80 years of warfare. In 1994, 50 years after D-Day, surviving members of the 101st Airborne returned to Normandy. Some, though in their 70s, insisted on making a commemorative parachute jump. The C-47 seconds were restored, their engines trembling with the same vibration the men remembered from 1944. One veteran carried a reproduction of his wartime bandolier. Inside were blank cartridges, lightweight, ceremonial. But as he stepped to the door and saw the green fields below, he said to the jumpmaster, "Feels heavy again." After landing, he placed the bandolier in the grass and whispered, "That's enough carrying." It was both tribute and release. In the end, the doctrine's endurance lies not in manuals, but in what it represented, a precise measure of human capacity. 48 hours, neither mythic nor infinite, but real, measurable, endurable. 2 days was the limit of what a man could fight without rest, food, or hope. Beyond that, willpower faltered, and only chance remained. To survive those 2 days was to master the narrow frontier between control and chaos. Every generation since has measured its endurance by that same unseen clock. The night of September 17th, 1944, returns often in the veterans' memories. The vibration of the C-47 seconds, the red light over the door, the weight of the second bandolier pressing against the chest. At the time, it was only precaution, a response to failure. Yet, in hindsight, that moment marked a quiet revolution. When Sergeant Evans checked the metal clasp of his bandolier and muttered, "Guess they don't plan on seeing us for a couple of days," he unknowingly spoke the prophecy of an era. Those 2 days became legend not because of victory, but because they revealed the depth of ordinary endurance. The paratroopers of World War II did not seek myth. They sought to survive. And in doing so, they redefined the meaning of strength not as freedom from burden, but as the courage to bear it longer than expected. That is why their story endures not in medals or monuments, but in the simple lesson each carried: carry enough, endure enough, hold for 48 hours. Because sometimes history is written not by the victors, but by those who can hold just long enough for the world to change around them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.